Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be joining with you today in the celebration of National Philanthropy Day. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion in philanthropy. So let me share my screen with you. So the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors have come up with their definition of philanthropy and diversity and inclusion in the area of philanthropy. And specifically, they describe it as diversity being the practice of including a full range of perspectives, ideas, and experience in philanthropic decision-making, whereas inclusion is an effort to seek the participation of individuals from diverse backgrounds in the process. Another organization, D5, which is a group of foundations specifically focused on how to enhance diversity and inclusion in the philanthropy space, comes up with the following remark. While a truly inclusive group is necessarily diverse, a diverse group may or may not be inclusive. So I thought I'd spend a few minutes today talking about why does diversity matter? Well, we know that diverse group of individuals consistently outperform others as far as solving problems. Multiple studies have shown that diverse boards of directors of public companies, for example, have a better return on investment to their shareholders. And we also know that broad-reaching solutions to challenging problems will most likely result when the individuals around the table don't think in a similar way. So when we take that to the area of philanthropy, we know that philanthropists who want to increase their impact are very often turning to diversity and inclusion as tools for effective giving. And just one example that I've read about reflects that a group that was really focused on the lower economic group in their community came up with the idea to show up at maternity wards and present new parents with a car seat. I thought this was a wonderful way to add value to the community. What they didn't realize, because they had no representatives of that community around the table when they came up with the solution, was that most of the people they were dealing with did not have automobiles. So just an example of how a well-intended effort completely missed the mark because of the failure to have diverse representatives around the table. We also know that historically, philanthropy as an industry has not been particularly effective at increasing diversity and inclusion. Just 8.4% of foundation CEOs or presidents are diverse, and less than 7% of our grants go to diverse communities. More importantly, more than 80% of foundation staffs are non-diverse. So that lack of diversity in the staff and leadership of philanthropic organizations have an impact. Now, how do we know that? Well, the reality is that we all have some form of implicit bias. And this is bias that, for the most part, we're not even aware that we have. And if we were conscious of it, we would deny that it exists. These biases are stories that we make up in our head because it helps us to identify groups of people and know something about who they are. This kind of stereotyping is really our brain's method of organizing a large amount of information into usable information for us. These biases are involuntary. So even on a conscious basis, when you believe you have no bias at all, oftentimes this implicit bias impacts your ability to be objective in your decision-making. And we know that this implicit bias is found in our brains. It's been confirmed by neuroscientists. I often think of the brain as a computer, with the unconscious mind being the operating system. The conscious mind is a collection of applications. So our brain creates files so that we can organize a tremendous amount of information that we perceive around us, whether it's through the media, what we read, what we see in our everyday experience, and we categorize this information in files in our head. Oftentimes, we're not even aware of the unconscious associations that exist. And one of my favorite examples is when you see a 300-pound, bald-headed, tattooed guy in a wife-beater shirt on a Harley Davidson. Most of us will presume that we can automatically tell you what kind of education that person has, what their political affiliation is, what kind of job they might have, And when that person tells us he is a PhD in English literature, it doesn't compute because our brain file for what that image looks like is inconsistent with that. And that's part of the reason that it's difficult for us to react to the person who's in front of us, instead of just pulling up our file in our brain and making assumptions about how that person behaves, reacts, believes. We also know there's such a thing as confirmation bias, which means that the implicit bias in your brain oftentimes makes us come to certain conclusions about the information we have before us in such a way that it allows that information that we see to be confirmed by that unconscious bias we have in our brain. And the truth of the matter is that people who are very smart are much better at confirmation bias than most. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of what we see as far as implicit bias and how it is reflected in our day-to-day decisions. There's a great study that was done showing implicit bias in evaluations. And in this study, there was a legal memo created with intentional inaccuracies in the legal analysis, grammatical mistakes, and other mistakes in the recitation of facts. It was given to 50 different law firm partners to analyze and evaluate. Half of those people were told that it was written by John Smith with a particular grade point average, an NYU grad who was Caucasian. The other half were told, same John Smith, same NYU, same GPA, but they were told it was written by an African American. Both sets supposedly of partners supposedly did this objective evaluation. What we found was the partners who believed that the author was white gave the paper a 4.1. Those who thought the paper was written by an African American gave it a 3.2, both on a 5-point scale. The Caucasian was praised for the potential and good analytical skills. The African American is criticized as average, and the partners are wondering how that person ever came to their law firm. But what was even more of greater concern, and this goes to the issue of confirmation bias, those people that thought they were reading a paper written by a Caucasian found less of the grammatical and other technical errors in the paper, whereas those who thought they were reading the paper of an African American seemed to find every possible error in the presentation. This is a perfect example of implicit bias in journalism. These are two photographs taken within days of the Katrina hurricane in New Orleans. The first one describes a young man who's walking through the water, having, quote unquote, looted a grocery store. He happens to be African American. The second picture is of a Caucasian couple, and they are described as two residents wading through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. Now, obviously, all three people were behaving in exactly the same way, but the journalists who were describing these photographs brought that implicit bias to their assumptions about what was really happening. One of the best examples of implicit bias is a long set of studies done with orchestral auditions. And this was in response to the fact that less than 5% of our top orchestras in the United States had women. Less than 5% of them were women. And so after much study, they decided that they would begin to do these auditions behind a screen. Now, of course, the maestros who were doing these evaluations, handling the auditions, were absolutely convinced that the only thing they cared about was the music, and were offended by the fact that anybody thought that not knowing the of the auditioner would make a difference in their evaluation. Well, what they soon found was that by having blind auditions, the number of women accepted into these major orchestras went up significantly. But at some point, it stalled. And what they decided was they needed to change the protocol yet again, because what they discovered was just knowing the clip-clop, hearing the clip-clop of heels versus the sloughing of loafers made a mental impression to the people doing the audition, so that they knew unconsciously whether the auditioner was a male or female, and that was impacting their ability to be objective in their evaluation. Today, the international protocol for orchestral auditions is that there is a carpet that leads up to a blind screen. So the people doing the auditions cannot hear even the footsteps of the people as they walk in. And so it is truly gender neutral. Currently, our orchestras have more than 30% women, and using this protocol, which is now accepted internationally, has increased the number of women in orchestras every single year. Many of us recognize the double standard in parenthood. Research shows that mothers are penalized in pay and promotions. And think of yourself, when someone comes into your office and tells you that they're going to be a new parent, chances are, if it's a woman, your immediate reaction is going to be, I bet her children are going to become more important than her job. And in fact, the next question is, how much longer will they work full time? When a man comes in, the presumption is great. They're now going to be a breadwinner. They're going to work harder than ever. And what we know is that, for example, in law, 65% of women say that the moment they became a mother, it altered the type of assignments and type of clients they were giving access to. On the other hand, fathers were more likely to get raises because they were now perceived to be breadwinners who had a family to support. Likability is another area that we know has a different impact on genders. Men can be seen as competent even though they're not likable. The last presidential election is evidence of this. For women, if you are not perceived as likable, it impacts the perception of whether or not you are competent. And it's one of the reasons why it's harder for assertive women to be seen as likable, and therefore oftentimes it impacts their ability to be perceived as competent. Successful women often describe great lengths to which they go to ensure that they can be perceived as likable because they recognize it will impact their ability to achieve success. So how do we overcome this implicit bias? Since we know that we're representing much more diverse communities than ever before, it's critically important that we each evaluate the implicit bias that we ourselves have and begin to understand how it impacts our decisions. Everything from who we hire, who we give raises to, and who we give philanthropic grants to. There is something called an IAT test, an implicit bias test. If you've not taken it, it is free, it's online. It takes just a few minutes to take the test, and the results are completely confidential. More than 5 million people have taken it. If you're interested in testing your own implicit bias as to gender, race, age, you can even test whether you have implicit bias based on religion or obesity. It's harvard.edu at implicit bias test. Because what we know is that bias starts from infancy. That if you take 6-month-old infants and you put half in pink shirts and half in blue shirts, those infants immediately congregate with the other infants that look like them. So if you imagine that this happens from the age of 6 months, you can just imagine that by the time you become an adult, how that bias continues to impact your decision making. We also know that it affects philanthropic decisions. Applicants are often labeled as risky simply because they lack the data to back up their proposed work. So as philanthropists, the questions you need to be asking is bias posing a risk? Is it playing a role in how you calculate risk for a potential new grantee? Are metrics created to value experience and community connections, perhaps over and above the solutions that are being proposed to you? It's also been suggested that lengthy grant applications and extensive reporting requirements imply a lack of trust, and that may impact the representation of the community that you choose to fund. Do those obligations negatively impact diverse leaders in your community? Does that lack of trust create a double standard that's impacted by implicit bias? And of course, most importantly, how about your own board of directors? your own advisory committee, your own grant makers. Do all of those groups truly reflect your community? If they don't, it's likely to be affecting your grant decisions and therefore potentially preventing your organization from being as inclusive as you would otherwise hope that it would be. So the key questions for grantors to ask is, how well do we really know the communities we serve? Are we listening to the different viewpoints in our communities? Do we have the right voices at the decision-making table? The questions that we need to consider are, how can we make better philanthropic decisions by ensuring that our diversity and inclusion is reflective of our communities? It will make us better decision makers, it will make us better problem solvers, and it will have a much greater impact on our community. I hope this was helpful in helping to articulate some of the things that we all should be thinking about. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.